So good afternoon. Welcome to our second research conversation of this fall semester. We had a great one a few weeks ago with Amy Roth McDuffie, and I know this will be great as well today. I have the honor of introducing to you two of our very highly successful assistant professors, and I consider both of these presenters today rising stars for the College of Education. So Dr. Bruno and Dr. Holly Whittenburg, they will both speak to us today on supporting the successful transition of students with disabilities from school to adult life through policy and practice. They will present their research on two individual projects related to the transition from school to adult life for students with disabilities. They will then discuss how their two lines of research converge and the great work they both do together. Later on, near the end of the presentation, we will have time for discussion. So this is part of what we call conversation. This is part of the signature of this program. Just to let you know just a little bit of their bios, Lauren's research focuses on improving transition outcomes for youth with disabilities. More specifically, she focuses on improving the preparation of pre-service and in-service educators' ability to implement evidence-based practices related to transition. And he also uses the UDL framework to improve post-school outcomes of youth with disabilities and post-secondary educational opportunities for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Lauren also focuses on the shortage and high attrition rates of special educators, such an important area even now. So all this research focuses on improving employment opportunities for transition-age students on the autism spectrum and students with intellectual disability. Her research, recent research examines interventions to teach employment-related skills, approaches to creating opportunities for inclusive work experiences, and how special education and vocational rehabilitation law and policies affect the transition experiences of students with disabilities. Another exciting line of research. Again, these are two of our great assistant professors, rising stars. It's been my personal pleasure working with both of them. And I know, as I always say, the best of them is even yet to come. I can see that they have such great careers, and we're excited that they are here with us. Please join me in welcoming Lauren and Holly today.
Thanks, Shola. I'm going to share my screen now. All right. Can we all see that? Yes. Okay. I see thumbs up. All right, great. So like Shola said, Holly and I will today be presenting about supporting the successful transition of students with disabilities from school to adult life, and our focus on policy and practice. And so here's our agenda. So we are each going to take time just to introduce ourselves briefly so you can put a name to a face. And then I'm going to share about teachers' use of high leverage and evidence-based practices to improve transition outcomes. And Holly is going to focus on her work around school to work for students with disabilities and the transition there. So I'm Lauren Bruno. I'm an assistant professor of special education. This is my third year here on the Pullman campus, and I am excited to share my work with you today.
And I'm Holly Whittenburg. I too am a third-year assistant professor of special education, also based out of Pullman, and just really excited for this opportunity. And like the fun part is that I also get to present with one of like my very favorite collaborators, Lauren. So we're hoping for a really kind of rich discussion, and we're grateful for you being here. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. All right, so like I said, I'm going to share about my line of research first. And so I'm really focusing on teacher preparation and in-service professional development for secondary special educators specifically. So today I'm going to be really discussing the importance of transition, and then 2 projects that focus around these areas that I've been working on. And so my research, as Shola stated, is primarily focused on improving transition outcomes for youth with disabilities, with a focus on post-transition to post-secondary education or employment. And so really the first project I'm going to present on is presenting my research that focuses on evaluating the knowledge and practices of teachers of students with disabilities and their use of evidence-based transition practices. So as we know, policy such as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004 and the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015. IDEA requires transition services and promotes the use of evidence-based and high leverage practices. ESSA also does this through the inclusion of universal design for learning within its policy. Yet we know that even though policy is saying we should be doing these things, students are still experiencing lower outcomes, specifically in the areas of employment, graduation rates, and enrollment in post-secondary education. What we know from the research is evidence-based transition practices can be used to improve these outcomes for students with disabilities. And the use of high leverage practices, which includes the use of universal design for learning, can support students' achievement across areas as well. Yet we know from the literature, teachers lack the knowledge to effectively implement the evidence-based transition practices, and that pre-service preparation programs are not giving them the tools they need to effectively do these in the field. And so what we know, though, is teachers' instruction can affect this and improve this. And so through professional development, we can do this. So my first project I'm going to talk about is validating the task to enhance teachers' use of transition practices. So the task is the Teacher Activity Survey, Transition and Technology, and this current project is actually being supported by a new faculty seed grant here at Washington State. And I've been partnering with Holly and Marcus and Don on this project as well. But the Teacher Activity Survey is really developed to determine teachers' knowledge and self-efficacy to implement transition evidence-based practices, while also focusing on what professional development they've received to focus on these areas. And so what we want to know is essentially what is helping you become more competent in delivering evidence-based transition practices. So the task is a self-report instrument developed to evaluate the teacher's self-efficacy. And it was based on the Eisenhower Professional Development measure initially and adapted and for my dissertation. And now I've been working to validate it using a national sample of educators. So the goals of this project are to further develop and modify the task, to evaluate the PD experiences of secondary special educators and their knowledge and skills. And so we've recently updated the task with more recent literature that has come out around evidence-based transition practices. And then after sending the survey out and getting our participants, we plan to utilize confirmatory and exploratory factor analyses to assess the reliability and validity of the task. And this is in partnership with the LPRC. And then really analyze this to the task to then address the gaps in literature and investigate the relationship between professional development and teacher self-efficacy as related to evidence-based transition practices. And as we validate the task, it's hopefully going to help us better understand what types of PD are being offered, the quality of professional development, and teachers' ability to implement and utilize evidence-based practices, which can then help us inform and create additional professional developments for teachers, specifically secondary special educators. So this is the timeline of this project. We have updated the task. It is in Qualtrics, and like I said, it's based on the most recent literature that has come out around research evidence-based practices for youth with disabilities, transition age youth specifically. And now we are going to begin pilot testing within Washington and then hoping to send out for a national recruitment sample by the start of next semester. The listserv has been created, and one of the things that I would like to shout out is I hired a ROAR intern who has helped create that listserv of national state transition coordinators and university special education program contacts. And so my WSU Roar intern has been really supportive in developing this list for dissemination. So shout out to them. And so by getting this sample of 1,000, that should give us enough power to effectively validate and assess the reliability of the measure. Then within partnership with the LPRC, we're going to do the data analysis, really run those descriptives just to see what teachers are saying, their confidence to implement these are, their knowledge, and then the types of PD they're finding to be most effective. And then I already stated that. So this is a current project that I'm working on right now. It's exciting, and hopefully we can use it to inform future projects around the development of professional development and really focusing on how we can utilize external funding to support that work too. So my next area that's still focused on professional development, but in a different area, is the development of an online module to support special educators in implementing the Universal Design for Transition framework. So I'm aware many of you may not be familiar with the Universal Design for Transition framework, so I'm going to take a minute to explain that. But it essentially, Universal Design for Transition framework takes the 3 principles of Universal Design for Learning and core principles of what we know of effective transition practices and what they are. And so as you can see on the graphic, the transition domains include multiple means of assessment. And that really looks at not just looking at one type of assessment, but really utilizing both formal and informal assessments to get a whole picture of who the student is, their strengths, abilities, and interests. So not just doing one interest inventory and using that for transition planning, but using a holistic look at different areas and different types of assessment to get a broader range of what the student would want to do. Next is student self-determination. So how we're really including that student in the process, letting them problem solve through this, and coming up with their goals and ways to achieve them. And then multiple life domains really looks at transition beyond just one linear idea of potentially post-secondary ed to employment and beyond. It's really looking at transition holistically. So where do you see yourself living? Where do you see yourself attending school? Where do you see yourself working? What types of activities are you looking at? What does transportation look like? Who do you want to affiliate yourself with? So really looking at those multiple life domains rather than just one transition outcome. And then the last is multiple resources and perspectives. And this is where we're bringing in a ton of different folks to give different perspectives and resources within the community and connections to support student transition. So that may include agencies, families, friends, future employers, current teachers, current coaches, current peer mentors, or different areas. And this can change and vary across students' transition timelines as well. And then so it takes these ideas of the best practices within transition and the Universal Design for Learning and blends them together to create this Universal Design for Transition framework. And what we see then is we're no longer having this disconnect between academic content and transition content. And we're looking at ways where they can intersect and overlap, and students' transition skills and areas can be focused on in academic content, therefore promoting more inclusion and inclusive settings. So, as I stated earlier, we know from other research that teachers are having a difficult time doing this. And so what we're seeing is a need for practical professional developments for people in the field. So that led us to creating an online module. So it's asynchronous professional development that teachers can access. And then throughout different time points within, they are revising lesson plans. And that's what we're currently studying. So we create modules and we utilize adult learning theory. If you scan the QR code, you can see the modules on the upper right. But it's really built off prior research that we've conducted that looked at training teachers on these concepts and seeing how their lesson plans have improved or how they were more likely to include Universal Design for Learning or Universal Design for Transition principles. And so The way it begins is they upload one initial lesson plan, and then they complete part 1 of the modules, which is really focused on just universal design for learning. They then revise their lesson plan to incorporate the UDL principles. We then have a scoring rubric that we score that against. And throughout this process, we're also giving teachers feedback on their lesson plans, both positive and constructive, on areas to further consider. Then they complete part 2, which is really focused on those 4 main transition components of the UDT framework. They then revise their lesson plan again, and this is where we're really looking for the emphasis on connecting academics and transition skills in one inclusive setting. We then evaluate that, again, provide feedback, both praise and constructive, and then teachers are finished that part of the study. They then have the option to participate in focus groups, which are more utilized to inform our modules and their experience within the modules and things. And then we're also coding lesson plans to see which practices are most prevalent within. So what we're seeing is within our lesson plans currently that are scored, that we are seeing change within teachers' ability to include UDL and UDT principles within their lesson plans. We are seeing uneven growth, though, within the UDT framework. So the multiple means of assessments and the self-determination has been less represented within the UDT principles than in the other areas. So our next steps, though, are to continue this research and finalize our findings, and then hopefully apply this to a broader scope to include now pre-service teachers as well, to support those secondary educators in thinking about how the UDT framework could be utilized within their classes. So a way we could do this is through teacher prep programs, enrich existing transition programs, and then within local school divisions in a variety of professional development to new teacher activities and things. And since we are situated in a rural area, the use of online modules also allows us to tap into or provide professional development to folks who may have less access, or professionals who may have less access to this. And then finally, hoping to utilize this with transition specialists who can then implement it within their districts as well. So that is my research on professional development, teachers' use of high leverage, and my broad focus on evidence-based transition practices. So thanks. I'll shoot it over to Holly now.
Thanks, Lauren. I love hearing about, I feel like I know a lot of the work that you do, but it's really fun and interesting to hear about some of the really exciting projects that you're working on right now. Yeah. So Lauren just talked a bit about her focus, which really is, again, that transition from school to adult life for students with disabilities, but with that emphasis on teacher preparation, teacher professional development. The work that I do often aligns with Lauren's work because I too am interested in the transition from school to adult life for students with disabilities. But my emphasis a lot of times is looking at specifically that pathway from secondary and post-secondary education to employment and careers and work. And I think part of that too reflects, kind of where I come from. I am a special educator, but prior to being a special educator, I was a job coach who worked with adults with disabilities out in the community. And before coming to WSU, while I was a doc student, I also worked for Virginia Commonwealth University's Rehabilitation Research and Training Center, where a lot of the projects and the grants that we were working on really did focus on pathways to employment for young adults with disabilities, particularly young adults on the autism spectrum and young adults with intellectual disabilities. So Lauren, if you want to pop over to the next slide, I see we have I love seeing all the graduate students who are here on the call as well. So in my coursework as a doc student, we very much had a focus on policy as well, and special education policy and understanding it. And one of the things that was really interesting was as I was going through my doctoral studies, there was this sweeping law that kind of changed things, right? So I think for graduate students and doc students too, it's sometimes being aware of and kind of, hey, what's happening out there that could potentially influence how, the field and how we do things. Well, for me, there was the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014. And although we know that IDEA really governs special education law for students with disabilities, there's these other laws and policies that affect their experiences as well. And WIOA was a huge one. In that, up until that time, vocational rehabilitation agencies, or the state agencies who are charged with supporting people with disabilities and finding employment and helping them maintain employment. Previously, their work around students with disabilities had very much been this kind of sequential handoff, right? Like, schools, you do your thing, and then we're going to pass the baton to adult agencies such as vocational rehabilitation. But with WIOA, that really changed. And lawmakers almost got ahead of things to say, hey, we recognize that starting early, coordinated collaborative services are more likely to improve outcomes for this group of students who have seen very poor but stable bad outcomes over the last 20 years. So what do we do differently instead? Well, WIOA hit out a couple of key things. First, we need vocational rehabilitation professionals to be working collaboratively and in coordination with schools. And there are these 5 areas that the law defines of services that can be provided to students with disabilities by vocational rehabilitation while they're in K-12. And those are these pre-employment transition services. And they go around career awareness, work experiences, instruction and self-advocacy, workplace readiness training, or those soft skills, and then also counseling on opportunities for enrollment in post-secondary education. WIOA also intensively broadened the expanse of who those students are by not just being students with disabilities who receive special education services, but also students on 504 plans and students with medically documented disabilities who might not be receiving any kind of specialized services in their K-12 settings. To accomplish all of this work, Lauren, was it doing weird stuff? Okay, we can stick here for a minute. I think that's where we're headed next. So to accomplish all this work, they'd also put some money into it. And this is a pretty big deal. 15% of all the federal money that goes to state vocational rehabilitation agencies now has to be spent on providing these pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities. The law also requires that states document biannually, so every 2 years, the progress that they're making through these very robust, elaborate state plans on their plans for implementing these specific parts of the law. Lauren, do you mind going to the next one, please? So as an early career researcher, one of the things that I think, is often hard too, and of course we were in COVID as well. So I was thinking about, okay, what do these changes in the law mean for services and the systems of services for students with disabilities, right? It also meant how can I learn about this when I don't have the resources to survey state leaders? I can't run a national survey right now, right? I don't have extensive resources to do focus groups and things like that. So as a doc student, what I found was with my cadre of other doc students and our advisors was, hey, look, here are these publicly available plans that describe what's happening and what states are planning to do. And this really started a line of research for me. So working with a collaborative team, first out of Virginia Commonwealth University, including fellow doc students and my advisors, I was second author on an initial paper that looked at the 2018 state plans for how are we going to do these voc rehab pre-employment transition services. And we used a sampling method to get a robust representative sample of different kinds of states. And then we qualitatively coded those state plans to see, okay, what are states planning to do? And what in response to this new law, right? And what we found was that states were really focused on employment skills, but that there was less focus on post-secondary education for students with disability, and also less focus on instruction and self-advocacy. We saw these exciting kind of innovative things that states were beginning to do and thinking about how we can provide these services outside of traditional K through 12 context. And then we also saw how they were starting to develop networks of stakeholders that included employers, businesses, institutes of higher education to start to do this work, but that also families were and students themselves were less represented in these kind of people who were, and as also probably the most critical stakeholders, they were less represented in these plans of how states were going to do this work, which led to the second iteration. And this is going to be what I'm talking about today. So this is really the second box here. New plans came out in 2020. I was a new first-year assistant professor. It was COVID. I want to continue this line of research. What are the things that I can start to thinking about? What are the next steps for building upon this? Well, one of the questions that we had after this, the conclusion of that first study was like, well, how good are these plans? Are they? Do they include what we know to be evidence-based practices that are likely to result in improved employment outcomes for students with disabilities? Do they include those predictors, those things that we know from the literature are most likely to have a positive relationship between this happening and students with disabilities ending up with successful employment outcomes? So what I want to take a few minutes to talk about today is the work that we've been doing around this content analysis of research-based transition recommendations within state and territory plans. So Lauren, do you mind clicking to the next one? So in this current study, I have been working with colleagues from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, from the University of Maine, and from the University of Missouri at St. Louis to conduct a content analysis of the publicly available. We have 54 of them. New York and New Jersey did not turn in their plans for some reason, so we don't know what's going on with them. But we looked at 54 of the state and U.S. territory plans for how these vocational rehabilitation organizations, how are they going to serve and what services are in programming are they going to be providing to students with disabilities? Looking back within our existing transition-based research literature, there were two seminal systematic lit reviews that have been conducted over time, and the most recent updates came out in 2021 from Mazzotti and Rowe that identified 16, that identified evidence-based practices for transition that were related to employment and predictors that were related to employment outcomes for youth with disabilities. We took those predictors and practices, looked at the pieces that would be malleable or influenceable by state vocational rehabilitation agencies, mapped them onto existing state vocational rehabilitation agency requirements for the services that they had to provide, and developed these 16 distinct research-based transition recommendations. And what we were curious about is, well, what is the extent to which these best practices are actually present within these state plans for how we're going to provide these services to students? So we developed a code book. We read the entirety of the VR portions of all of these state plans. Typically, they're like 300 some page documents, and the vocational rehabilitation pieces range from like 60 to 120 pages. And we coded them to see the extent to which these recommendations were present within the plans. Inter-rater reliability for that first piece of coding was listed there, 87.5 to 91.25%. I think where we saw discrepancies in coding, it was oftentimes where things maybe weren't very explicitly defined within the plans themselves. And so we had to kind of come to consensus and make sure that we had that really adequately reflected within our code book in terms of examples and non-examples. And then we did a second round of coding to make sure we hadn't missed anything by going back in and doing a search of keywords for each of those research-based transition recommendations. Lauren, can you flip to the next one for us? And so, you know, I've been kind of yammering on about these research-based transition recommendations, here's what they really are, right? So we had these 5 areas that kind of highlight those or mirror those pre-employment transition services that I talked about just a minute or two before, around career awareness, which is really around career exploration activities and mentoring, work preparation experiences that include paid work, general work experiences that that often were not paid, such as work-based learning experiences or internships or job shadowing, things of that nature. A specific internship model that's well represented within the research literature, project search, work study, and career and technical education. Within collaboration, there were 2 kind of key from the research pieces we were looking for: family involvement and interagency collaboration. And then within like student skill development, research told us that self-determination, teaching around independent living, around social skills, around use of technology, and oftentimes a kind of mishmash of those within community-based instruction is important. And then when it comes to the transition planning process itself, or those plans that teams make to support students in making a successful transition from school to work, there's person-centered planning and then student involvement within that practice. So what did we find? Let's flip to the next one and we'll talk about that. So we saw that across all 54 state and territories, there was an average of 9.92 research-based transition recommendations within plans. So that range for that actually ranged from 3 to 15 research-based transition recommendations. And most of the plans, 46 of them, had between 8 and 12 RBTRs. Interesting to find out, and looking across states, are the plans the states or the territories who had kind of these kind of like the most quality indicators presence within their plans were Alabama, Idaho, Kentucky, Nevada, and Wyoming. Plans with the least number of kind of these quality indicators or transition recommendations were Guam, Louisiana, and New Hampshire. What was really, really interesting was looking at kind of what was most represented. What were states talking about that they were going to do? Well, they were going to do career exploration and career awareness. They were also going to be doing interagency collaboration. So that's thinking about vocational rehabilitation agencies partnering with schools and other partners within the community to provide these services to students. General work experience, or that unpaid work experience, was also represented quite frequently. Paid work experience was not, right? So although there was a majority of states who had some kind of plan for paid work experience for students with disabilities, it wasn't to the same extent as general work experience, which is worth noting, both in terms of that importance and that kind of justice issue around being paid for the work that you do, right? And also around, because we know that paid work experience is a really, really strong predictor of competitive integrated employment outcomes, or successful in employment outcomes for students with disabilities after they leave school. We also found some places where things were least represented, right? Some of these like quality indicators, recommendations where they were least represented. And 2 of those were work study and community-based instruction, which I really think is more a shifting focus. These are kind of more generic terms that used to be used more frequently in the past, but as more specific models of doing and being that work are happening, I think they're just being used less frequently. However, career and technical education only showed up, and I think the exact number was 33% of these plans, which is a problem and an area for growth, given that CTE or existing structures that are right out there for anyone, right? They're in school. So how can we make those more inclusive and get students those skills? Similarly, instruction in technology or technology skills was also not well represented within plans, and is another area for growth, given how we know how important those skills are for careers of today and for careers of the future, and also for just managing our lives day in, day out, right? The other piece that I thought was really, really interesting, and that we're really excited to kind of talk about as we're preparing this manuscript for publication right now, is that while instruction and self-advocacy or self-determination, this idea of students being in charge of and agents of the things that happen within their lives, having autonomy and control over decision-making, while instruction in that was the most represented work readiness training skill within the plans, actual student involvement plans saying how students were going to be involved in their own transition planning was only represented in 11% of plans. So obviously there's some kind of disconnect that's happening there between what we're teaching students and actually giving them real life authentic opportunities to do that work. The big asterisk with this study, of course, is that these are plans for implementation. There are questions and the follow-up that we want to do to look at, okay, well, how well are these also happening in real life with the actual services that are being provided to students and to their families? The other piece as we move forward and that we're really interested in looking at too is to go back to that state piece. And we're actually conducting a regression analysis now, an exploratory one where we've created a model that looks at some different levels of state factors, like around state demographics, state policies, training and support, to see if there's any relationships potentially between what we would think might be state characteristics that might influence what's in these plans or not. So I will have to keep you all posted on that one. Lauren, do we want to kind of tie it all up together with what this means and what this means for the work that we're doing together?
Yeah, definitely. All right, go ahead, Holly. You want to start?
Yeah, so I think, that talk about self-determination and students being involved in their own planning is an area where Lauren and I are really starting to work together. And we're working both with our amazing leadership team within ROAR, and also several of our ROAR graduate students. I know some of whom are on the call now, to look at how do we in our program within here in ROAR, how do we do person-centered planning? How do we help students to be in charge of and support them in planning for their own futures? And we're doing that in a couple of different ways. Lauren and I have been working with a group of graduate students here. We've conducted a scoping review of person-centered, exactly, Kelly, Jenna, Catherine, and also Dr. Amber Brown Ruiz, our amazing postdoc. So we've been working with that team to conduct a scoping review looking at person-centered planning within the literature around transition-age youth with disabilities to identify both best practices and then also where there are gaps and what is unknown. Amber and her work around culturally responsive practices, we've been able to she's really been supporting our team too in both developing a framework to think about what does culturally responsive practices within this larger person-centered planning process look like. That's been a piece of the scoping review that we've been doing, and it's also starting to influence the work that we're doing in creating a fidelity of implementation checklist and thinking about those pieces that we need within ROAR to ensure that we're providing high quality supports and planning services to our students. Lauren, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, definitely. So the person-centered planning work is really exciting, and it's research that is directly connected to practice within ROAR, right? Something that we both are very passionate about. But then ROAR has other areas too, and one of them is employment services. And so I'm just going to quickly touch on the other two before we open it up for questions. But Holly, this is Holly's grant, actually, the work-related social skills. And that was under a faculty funding award. And right now we just completed pilot testing with ROAR employer partners to develop a measure really looking at what social skills employers value most for students coming into employment, specifically those with IDD. And so that's been piloted, and we are working again with a wonderful ROAR interns that we've hired who helped us develop a database of all-inclusive post-secondary ed programs nationally to send out a national survey to programs who will then share it with their employer partners to then get a national sample of kind of, again, in what industries are prioritizing which social skills and vice versa. And so that is exciting work that Holly is leading. And then again, we are interviewing transition leaders to, again, determine areas of need for partnerships and how we can better improve our programming and the needs in service delivery and personnel prep. So I'm sure you can see some parallels between my and Holly's work, especially with our focus on research-based transition practices, but in two different areas, right? As Holly looks at policies and state plans, and I look at the preparation of in-service and pre-service teachers. So thanks for your time. I'm going to unshare our screen, so we can open it up for questions.
AJ, please.
Sure, I'd like to start my question now, and that was a great presentation, both of you. I really learned a lot about your work. I've had a ROAR student in my 301 section for several years now. And so I'm familiar with their work, and I'm familiar with the limitations and so forth that we work with, and so on and so forth. Could you tell me a bit more? You just got very much at the end there about ROAR and sort of evidence-based practices that you get out of ROAR, or what is ROAR? What is the sort of bridge that ROAR is providing for not only these students, but for your work?
Yeah, definitely. Holly, do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
Go for it, Lauren. Then I can. Yeah.
So Holly and I are both co-PIs right now on the TIPSID federally funded grant that supports ROAR. And within that, it's a model demonstration project. So what we're really looking to do is how we bring research into ROAR to make sure that we are doing the best practices for our students. Overall, we know inclusive PSCs are good, right? They lead to greater employment outcomes and or enrollment in traditional post-secondary education institutes after they've completed an inclusive PSC. We know they lead to greater levels of independent living within the community and community engagement. But one of the things as we bring research into ROAR is what we're really looking to do is really make that connection between the research and practice. So within our person-centered planning scoping review, we were doing practices, but we knew we had to enhance them in a way that was sustainable and meaningful for our staff as well. And so that's where we began our scoping review, to start with the research, touch on that, and see what we're doing that aligns and where we need to improve. And so as we're in year 3 now of our model demonstration, right, we're working towards establishing those practices. And I think that's across all areas in our academic classes and our employment services program and different things like that.
And I would just chime in on that, Lauren, as we said, this idea of person-centered planning is the idea that the student really, it's their dreams and visions for their future, and then how ROAR as a program can help support them in achieving those. One of the things that we were also really mindful of and wanted to be sure of, because sometimes there can be some baked in assumptions there around what it means to be an adult, what a successful life looks like. And we wanted to make sure that the work that we're doing within ROAR as we hold those meetings and we support students and families is that we're also recognizing and celebrating the cultures and communities that our families and our students come from, and not making sure that we're also kind of pushing a one size fits all on what it means to be an adult, right? Or what it means to have a successful life. So that's, I think, where we've been really so lucky to have Amber Brown, Dr. Brown Ruiz's expertise and support here too, and helping us kind of think about our structures and to infuse that into our scoping review to see what does the literature tell us about how do we do person-centered planning in a culturally responsive way, and how can we create measures and support for our staff and our families and our students to ensure that we're doing that within ROAR as well.
Thank you. I've got another question, but we're going short on time, and I want to make sure I'll ask it of you otherwise, but want to make sure others can ask questions, please.
Anyone else have questions? Take it away, AG.
So you sort of made some comments and I guess criticism of undergraduate teacher preparation as not having enough. How do we go about doing that? Because I certainly talk, you know, 301 is like Piaget on Tuesday and Vygotsky on Thursday kind of course. How do we have time to do that in our undergraduate preparation if they are not special education endorsement people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, and I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's why a lot of my work is focused on the professional development of in-service teachers now and where we can pack it in there. I recognize that I can't go to every teacher prep program and say, you need to improve transition planning, right? Because there isn't enough time all the time, right? But I think using those inclusive or promoting inclusive practices throughout our coursework and reiterating is a good way to reinforce that specifically for our general educators. But that's why a lot of my work is focused on the in-service development. But Holly, if you want to add to that.
Well, so it's not my work, but there's some really interesting work being done. Val Mazzotti and Allison Lombardi. Val Mazzotti is out of UNC Charlotte and Allison Lombardi is out of Connecticut. And right now they're really starting to look at and think about and frame transition for students with disabilities, looking at a multi-tiered systems of support model. So if we think about Washington and the High School and Beyond program or plan, High School and Beyond plan, like we're doing, particularly within like employment and college and career readiness, we're starting to do some of this work. But I think it's getting systematic and thinking about what are those universal supports or services that all middle and high schoolers need, right? To be exploring careers and understanding opportunities and things like that. And then where are those pieces where we need to like up the ante to the next tier of instruction, right? To support learners with different exceptionalities and being able to access those and to be successful within them. And so to me, like, I'm really excited and really interested in this idea that they're starting to come up with, like really, and more than come up with, they've come up with it and they're starting to like think about it, but multi-tiered systems of support as a way to kind of conceptualize some of this work around career and college readiness is pretty interesting to me right now as well.
We have 1 minute left. Anyone have any other questions? Shola, Laura, anyone?
No, I just want to say a big thank you to Lauren and Holly. I mean, for me, what really stood out is the way you have been able to bring your two lines of research together. I think it's really impressive. So thank you for what you do and thank you for the presentation today. AJ.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really interesting and really well integrated. Your slides were great. I really appreciated it. So thank you very much. You got a good audience too. You got a good number. So know that. So that's great. A lot of good interested people. Yeah. Anyone else have anything to say? If not, we'll just thank them very much and have a good rest of your day, both of you and all of you.
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. It was super fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.